The fog came off the river that autumn the way it always did, thick and low and smelling of coal smoke and wet stone, and something faintly sweet underneath, like apples going soft in a cellar. It settled over Belcross Almshouse before dawn, and did not lift until noon, if it lifted at all. By November the whole building smelled of tallow candles and boiled linen, and the particular staleness of rooms where the windows are kept shut against the cold. Verity Hale was the kind of woman a room forgot the moment she left it. Not ugly, not pretty either, not in any way that made men turn. She was thin in the wrists and plain in the face, with brown hair she wore scraped back under a cap because loose hair only got in the way of work, and she had been at Belcross 3 years now, mending linens for 4 shillings a week and whatever bread the matron did not need. She had not always mended linens. Her father had been a schoolmaster once, in a village 2 days north, before the fever took him and left her nothing but his coat. His boots, and the letters he had spent every evening of her childhood teaching her to read. She did not remember much of him now without effort. She remembered his voice, low and patient, sounding out words by the fire. She remembered that he had never once told her a lie, even a small one, even to spare her feelings, and that this had cost him friends and had cost her, later, a great deal of comfort she might otherwise have had. She had one competence, and it was this: she could read, and read well, in a clear, unhurried voice that did not stumble over long words. It was not a skill that fed her. It was a skill nobody had ever paid for. But it was hers, and she used it the way other women used a needle or a ladle, without thinking much about it, because it was simply the thing she could do. The East Room at Belcross was the room nobody chose to work in if they had a choice. It held 6 beds, and by that November 5 of them were empty, their occupants dead, or discharged, or moved elsewhere, and the 6th held a man nobody visited. He had been there longer than Verity had worked at Belcross. The matron called him Mr. Aldrich, and said only that he had come from a good family once, and that the family paid for his keep through a solicitor in town, and asked in writing every quarter that no more be said about it than that. He had had an apoplexy, the matron said. It had taken his speech, and most of the use of his left side, and left him a man who could turn his head and follow you with his eyes, and do very little else. He was going to die there, unremembered by whoever had put him there, before the year was out. Verity had thought that the first week she worked at Belcross, looking in at him from the doorway, and she had been ashamed of the thought, and had not been able to put it away. She began reading to him in October. It was not a decision so much as a habit that arrived without her noticing it arrive. She had finished her mending early one evening, and the matron's own small store of books held nothing she had not already read twice, and she found herself standing in the doorway of the East Room, with her father's old book of fables under her arm, the brown leather gone soft and pale at the corners. And she thought, well, he cannot tell me to go away. So she did not ask him. She only sat down in the chair by his bed, the one that nobody else used, and opened the book, and began to read. The fog was thick on the window that first evening, and the candle guttered twice, and she read him the fable of the fox and the crow, in a voice pitched low, so as not to carry into the corridor. Because she did not want the matron to think she was shirking her mending to sit and talk to a man who could not talk back. She did not expect anything from it. She did not think he understood a word, but his eyes had followed the candle flame, and then followed her, and when she finished the fable and looked up, she thought, for just a moment, that something in his face had eased. She came back the next evening, and the one after that. Within a fortnight it was simply what she did, the way other women visited a sister or said a prayer, an errand nobody asked her to run, and nobody thanked her for running, because nobody but the matron and the ward orderly even knew she ran it. The bridge over the bell cross, streamed 2 streets from the almshouse, had a rotted plank in it that was going to break under somebody's foot before the winter was out. Verity had told the parish about it twice, and been told twice that there was no money for it. She thought of the plank sometimes, walking home in the dark, and thought that most things that needed mending in this world went unmended, because nobody in particular was to blame for them, and so nobody in particular felt obliged to fix them. She did not know, that November, that something was about to be mended that she had never thought to ask for. She only knew that the old man in the East Room had begun, in the last week, to move the fingers of his right hand very slightly when she read, as though keeping time with the sentences, and that this had become, without her quite admitting it to herself, the best part of her day. The evening it happened, the fog was so thick that the lamplighters had given up on the far end of Candle Street, and Verity arrived at Belcross with her shawl soaked through, and her father's book wrapped inside her cloak to keep the damp off it. The matron had already gone to her rooms. The orderly was at his supper. The East Room was empty and dim, one candle burning low on the table, and Mr. Aldrich lay as he always lay, propped on 2 pillows, his eyes open and fixed on the window where there was nothing at all to see but fog. She sat down without a word, because there was never any need for a word, and opened the book, and found her place, and began. She read him the fable of the old lion and the fox that evening, the one where the fox will not enter the lion's den, because he sees many tracks going in, and none coming out, and she read it slowly, the way her father used to read it to her, giving the fox's caution its full weight. She did not perform the story. She never did. She read it the way she would have read it to no one at all, which was, she had come to think, the only honest way to read anything. She did not know that she was not, in fact, reading to no one. The Duke of Rothmere stood in the shadow of the corridor, beyond the East Room door, where the candlelight did not reach, and he had been standing there some minutes before she noticed nothing at all, because she never did notice, and he watched a woman he had never seen before in his life read fables in a low, unhurried voice to a man the rest of the world had agreed to forget. He had come, as he always came, after dark, alone, in a plain coat with no crest on it, telling the gatekeeper only that he was here on the solicitor's business, which was true enough as far as it went. He came perhaps twice a month. He never went in. He stood in the corridor for as long as he could bear it, which was rarely more than a quarter of an hour, and looked at his father through the open door, and then he left, and rode home, and told no one, because there was no one he wished to tell. Tonight he had come later than usual, and had meant, as always, only to look and go. Instead he found the room already occupied, a woman he did not know sitting where he had never seen anyone sit, her voice carrying just far enough down the corridor for him to catch the shape of the words without all of them, and his father's right hand moving faintly on the coverlet in time with her reading. He had not seen his father's hand move like that in 2 years. He did not go in. He told himself later that it was because he did not wish to frighten her. A stranger discovered eavesdropping in a corridor at night, though the truth, when he was honest with himself, which he tried always to be even when it cost him, was that he could not have made himself walk through that door for any reason on earth just then. He only watched. He watched her finish the fable and close the book gently, the way one closes a book near a sleeping child, and murmur something to his father that he did not catch, and rise, and gather her damp shawl about her shoulders, and go, without once looking toward the doorway where he stood. She did not know then that the man in the shadow of the corridor was the Duke of Rothmere, and that the man in the bed was his father, and that in 3 years of visiting that room in secret and shame he had never once, until tonight, seen anyone read to him at all. She refused the extra bread the matron tried to press on her the following week, saying only that she read to Mr. Aldrich because it passed the evening pleasantly and cost nothing, and that she would have done the same for any patient in the ward who had no one. The matron said that was as may be, but that it was a kindness all the same, and Verity had gone faintly red and said she would rather it not be spoken of, because it was not a kindness if people made a fuss over it. It was only a thing she did. She did not know that within the week a letter went from the solicitor's office to a house in town, informing a party who wished to remain unnamed that the patient Mr. Aldrich had shown the first marked improvement in 18 months, and that the improvement coincided with the regular attentions of one of the almshouse's laundresses, a Miss Hale, of good character, unmarried, no family, employed there 3 years without complaint. She did not know that the Duke of Rothmere read that letter twice, standing by his study window with the fog still thick on the glass, and that he sat for a long while afterward with his hand over his mouth, saying nothing, to no one, because there was no one in that house he trusted enough to say it to. She did not know that the following morning her wage at Belcross was quietly raised by 2 shillings a week at the direction of the same unnamed party, with instructions that Miss Hale was on no account to be told where the increase came from, only that the trustees had reviewed the almshouse accounts and found room for it. She thought it strange and pleasant, and did not think about it very hard, because she had learned young that good fortune examined too closely tended to evaporate, and she had bread now, and coal enough, and she went on reading to Mr. Aldrich every evening the weather allowed her to walk there, never once suspecting that she had already been seen and known and weighed by a man whose name she had not yet heard. The mending contracts came next, though she did not connect them to anything at all. A steward from a house she had never had dealings with sent word through the parish that Belcross's linens were wanted done properly, and would the almshouse recommend a reliable woman, and the matron recommended Verity, and Verity found herself with 3 extra shillings a week, and a standing order for as much fine work as she cared to take, delivered and collected by a manservant who never gave his master's name, and did not seem to expect to be asked for it. She did not ask. She had learned that too, from a childhood of taking what kindness came, and not interrogating it too closely, in case the interrogation revealed that it had not, after all, been meant for her. The old man's care improved in ways she noticed before she understood them. A physician began calling twice a week, where before none had called at all. New linen appeared on his bed, finer than anything else in the ward. A brazier was installed in the east room in December that kept the worst of the damp off, though no one at Belcross could say who had ordered it or who was paying for the coal. Verity noticed all of this the way one notices weather, as a fact of the world rather than a mystery requiring solution. She was glad of it for Mr. Aldrich's sake. She thought, if she thought about it at all, that some relative of his had at last taken an interest, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of the ordinary tardy conscience of families who let a person slip to the back of their minds until something reminds them he is dying. She did not know that the relative in question stood at the end of the corridor most weeks now, later even than before, and watched her read, and had begun, without entirely deciding to arrange his evenings around the hour she was known to come. He had not gone in. He told himself each time that he would, and each time found some reason not to, a meeting that ran late, a letter that could not wait, a cowardice he did not name as cowardice even in his own mind, though it was that, precisely, and he knew it. What he did instead, on a night in the second week of December, was walk into the East Room in daylight, in a plain coat, and introduce himself to the matron as Mr. Colwell, a friend of the family charged with looking in on Mr. Roach, Aldrich's welfare from time to time, and ask, quite reasonably, whether he might sit with the patient an hour, since he understood a Miss Hale had been kind enough to read to him, and he should like to see for himself how the old man did. The matron, who had no reason on earth to doubt a well-spoken gentleman in a good coat, said certainly, and that Miss Hale generally came in the evening, and that he was welcome to wait if he liked. He waited. Verity found him sitting in the chair that was, without either of them ever having said so, hers, when she came in with her shawl still damp from the walk and her father's book under her arm. He rose at once. He was tall and dark-eyed, and there was a thin white scar through one eyebrow that she would notice again and again over the coming weeks, without ever learning how he had come by it, and he had the stillness of a man who had trained himself not to fidget, which she would later come to understand was not calm at all, but its opposite, held very carefully in place. "I did not mean to take your chair," he said. "My name is Colwell." "I am told you read to Mr. Aldrich, I do," she said. "Every evening the weather allows it." "Why?" he asked. She considered the question seriously, because it had been asked seriously, and because nobody had ever asked her that before, not even the matron. "Nobody comes for him," she said. It seemed a poor thing, a man lying in a room with the door open and nobody troubling to walk through it. He did not answer that at once. He looked, for a moment, at the old man in the bed, and something moved through his face that she could not read, and was gone before she had finished trying. "You are not paid for it," he said. It was not quite a question. "No," she said. "I would not take payment for it if it were offered. It is not that kind of thing." "What kind of thing is it?" he asked. "The kind you do because it wants doing," she said, "and not because anyone is watching to see whether you do it." He looked at her for a long moment. She thought later that it was the first time in her life a man of evident quality had looked at her as though what she had said mattered, rather than as though she were a servant who had spoken out of turn. "Read to him now," he said. "I should like to hear it." She did. She read the fable of the ant and the grasshopper, because it was the next one in the book, and Mr. Colwell sat very still through the whole of it, and at the end he thanked her plainly, and said he would come again if she did not object, and she said she did not see why she should, since the room was not hers to keep him from. He came again 3 days later, and again the week after that, always in the evening, always in the plain coat, always giving his name as Colwell, and nothing more, and always sitting a little apart, watching more than he spoke. She learned in pieces over those weeks that he had known Mr. Aldrich a long time, that there had been some difficulty between the family and the old man before his illness, a quarrel Mr. Colwell would not describe beyond calling it a bitter one, over a marriage that had not taken place, and that he seemed to carry the memory of it the way a man carries a stone in his boot, aware of it with every step and unwilling to stop and remove it. "I was engaged once," he told her one evening, apropos of nothing, while she turned the pages of the book slowly, giving his father time to follow. She was thought a great beauty. She was cruel to a servant in front of me once, over a broken dish, cruel in a way that cost the girl nothing but her dignity, and cost my betrothed nothing at all. And I broke it off within the month, and my father called me a fool for it, and we had not spoken as we ought to have spoken since. Verity did not offer sympathy, because she had learned that sympathy offered too quickly tended to close a person up rather than open them. Was she wrong, or were you? She asked instead. I have wondered that for 3 years, he said, and have never once decided. Then it seems, she said, that you were right to break it off, whatever else is true. A man does not agonize 3 years over whether he was wrong to walk away from cruelty. He agonizes over whether he handled it well. Those are different questions. He looked at her for a long moment. You have a habit of saying things plainly, he said. I was taught by a man who never lied to me, she said. It left its mark. He did not tell her, that evening or any evening after it for some time, that the coal in the brazier was his, or the physician, or the 2 shillings, or the mending contracts, or that his own hands had once, in another coat entirely, held the letter that reported her kindness to a man who had not been able to stop reading it over. He asked her, instead, small questions about her father, and her village, and the fables she liked best, and gave nothing of himself in return beyond the broken engagement, which she came to understand, without being told, was the one wound he had let anyone near in a very long time. Lady Cordelia Thorne came to Belcross on the 2nd Tuesday in January, on one of the almshouse's quarterly inspection days, as she had come every quarter for the past 2 years in her capacity, self-appointed and never once challenged, as patroness of the parish charities. She was the Duke's aunt by marriage, his father's late wife's sister, and she had managed, in the years since the old man's illness, to make herself indispensable to the running of a household that had never asked to be run by her. She came through the wards with the matron trailing a half-step behind her, inspecting linens, inspecting accounts, inspecting, with a particular thoroughness that day, the East Room, where she found Verity sitting in the chair by Mr. Aldrich's bed, with the brown book open on her knee. "And who is this?" Lady Cordelia asked the matron, in the tone of a woman asking who had left a puddle on her floor. "Miss Hale, ma'am, one of our laundresses. She reads to Mr. Aldrich of an evening." Lady Cordelia's eyes went over Verity slowly, from her cap to her mended him, with the particular thoroughness of a woman who had made a study of exactly how much a person's clothing could be made to say about their worth. "How charitable," she said. "And who asked you to?" "No one, your ladyship," Verity said. "He has no visitors. It seemed unkind to leave him without any." Lady Cordelia's laugh was a small, practised thing, 3 beats, like a bell struck lightly and released before it could ring true. "How very good of you," she said, to notice what the family themselves had not troubled to arrange. "I wonder that a laundress finds the leisure for it. I wonder more that you imagine it is wanted. Some families prefer their misfortunes handled quietly, Miss Hale, and not turned into an occasion for a servant to display her Christian feeling to an audience of the sick and the dying." Verity did not stand. She did not curtsy either, though the matron beside her went rigid with the impulse to correct her for it. "I did not do it for an audience, your ladyship," Verity said. "There was none, until you came." The silence that followed had a shape to it. The matron would say later that she had never heard silence take before. Lady Cordelia's face did not change, but something behind it did, and she turned without another word and continued her inspection. and did not come near the east room again that day. Verity's hands, when she looked down at them afterward, were perfectly steady. She had trained herself young not to shake where it showed, whatever it cost her to hold them still, and it had cost her something that day, though she did not let the matron see it. Mr. Colwell came that evening earlier than usual, and she told him what had happened, not because she wanted comfort, but because it seemed a plain fact of her day that he ought to know, the way one reports weather. Lady Cordelia Thorne, he said, when she gave the name, and something in his voice had gone very flat and careful. You know her, Verity said. I know her, he said. She is not a woman whose opinion should trouble you. It does not trouble me, Verity said, and found, saying it, that it was almost true. What troubles me is that a woman with her advantages should spend them making a laundress feel small for reading a story to a dying man. That is not dignity. That is only cruelty with better manners than most. He was quiet a moment. Fair is not the same as kind, he said finally. There is a difference, and she has never learned it, and I do not think she means to. Verity looked at him properly then, in the low candlelight, and thought, not for the first time, that Mr. Colwell spoke sometimes like a man repeating a lesson he had paid a great deal to learn. You sound as though you have thought about her a good deal, she said. More than I would like, he said, and did not explain further, and she did not press him. Because she had begun to understand that there were rooms in this man he was not yet ready to open the door to, and that pressing only ever made a person shut a door harder. The letter came to Belcross a week later, delivered by the same manservant who had always brought the mending. But this time it was addressed to Verity herself, in a hand she did not know, and it informed her, with cold correctness, that the family retaining an interest in Mr. Aldrich's welfare had determined that his care would in future be managed by a trained attendant engaged for the purpose, and that Miss Hale's services, while appreciated, would no longer be required. There was no name signed to it. There never was. Verity read it twice by the window of her small room, and then folded it very carefully, and did not cry, because she had learned not to cry where it showed, and told herself that it was, after all, only sensible. A dying man ought to have proper nursing, not the amateur comfort of a laundress with a borrowed book. She told herself this several times, in several different orders, and found that none of the orderings made it easier to believe. She went to Belcross the next evening out of habit, before she remembered there was no longer any reason to go, and stood outside the east room door for a moment without going in, because a strange woman she did not know was sitting in the chair that had been hers, adjusting Mr. Aldrich's pillow with brisk professional hands. The old man's eyes found her in the doorway. His right hand moved on the coverlet, faintly, the way it had moved for weeks now when she read to him, and this time there was no book, no voice, nothing for the movement to keep time with, and she understood, watching it, that he was asking for something he had no words left to ask for, and that she could not give it to him. She left without going in. She told the matron she would not be coming in the evenings any longer, family arrangements having changed, and the matron, who had grown fond of her without ever quite saying so, asked no questions, because she had also grown wise enough, in a life spent watching people leave things unexplained, not to ask them. Mr. Colwell did not come that week, nor the week after. She told herself she was glad of it, since there was no reason now for their evenings to continue, the excuse of the East Room having been taken from both of them at once, and she was ashamed of how much the thought of never seeing him again cost her, given how little, in the strict accounting of things, she actually knew about him. She wrote him a short letter, care of the almshouse, since it was the only direction she had for him, thanking him for his kindness in visiting Mr. Aldrich these past weeks, and wishing him well, and releasing him, in as many words as she could manage, without sounding as though she were asking him to contradict her, from any obligation to continue an acquaintance that had been built entirely on an arrangement now ended. She did not know, sealing it, that she had just written to the Duke of Rothermere, care of an almshouse, informing him that he was under no obligation to see her again, and that he would read the letter standing in his own study with his jaw set so hard it ached, and that it would take him 3 more days to decide what, if anything, he could bring himself to do about it. It was Mrs. Prouse who found her, in the end standing at the market on a grey Thursday, with a basket of mending over one arm, and introduced herself as housekeeper to His Grace the Duke of Rothermere, and asked, with a directness that startled Verity into answering honestly, whether she was the Miss Hale who had read to Mr. Aldrich at Belcross. "I was," Verity said. "I am no longer engaged there in that capacity." "I know it," Mrs. Prouse said. "I was the one who wrote the letter ending it, on instruction, though I did not care for the writing of it, and I have not cared for much that has gone on in that house since. Will you walk with me a little way, Miss Hale? There is something you ought to know, and I have decided, God forgive me for interfering, that it is past time somebody told you." They walked as far as the churchyard wall, where the wind came cold off the fields, and Mrs. Prouse spoke in the plain, unhurried voice of a woman who had decided a thing needed saying, and meant to say it whole. "Mr. Aldrich in the East Room," she said, "is the Duke's own father. He has been these 3 years, since the apoplexy took him, kept apart from the family under a plain name, at his own asking before he lost the power to ask for anything, because he could not bear, he said, to be looked at by people who had known him whole. The Duke has visited him near every week since, in secret, standing in the corridor most times, because he cannot make himself go further, and has paid for every comfort the man has had, the physician, the coal, the fine linen, and asked that none of it be traced to him, because he does not believe he has earned the right to be thanked for it, given how long he stayed away before he started. Verity had gone very still. "Mr. Colwell," she said. "Is the Duke," Mrs. Prouse said. "He has gone by that name to you because he did not know, when he first sat down in that chair, what he wanted from you, or what he had a right to want, being who he is, and you being who you are, and a false name seemed, to a man as careful as he is. The only fair way to find out." Verity said nothing for a long moment. A rook called once, somewhere over the churchyard, harsh and flat in the cold air, and she watched it lift off the wall, and did not answer that either, not for a while. "Why did he stop me reading to him?" she said finally. "He did not, Mrs. Prouse said. Lady Cordelia did. She went to him the day after she met you at Belcross, and told him a laundress reading fables to a dying man in front of the ward was an embarrassment to the family, and he was fool enough, for one day, to believe letting her manage it was easier than fighting her over it. He has not had an easy hour since. He came to me 3 nights ago and asked, straight out, whether I thought you would ever speak to him again once you knew what he had done, and I told him I did not know, and that he had better go and find out himself instead of asking his housekeeper to do it for him. Verity looked down at her own hands, red at the knuckles from the lie, steady now though her heart was not. He should have told me who he was, she said. From the first evening, he should, Mrs. Prouse agreed. He will tell you that himself, I expect, better than I can tell it for him. I have said what I came to say, Miss Hale. The rest is his to say, or lose the chance of saying. He came to her 2 evenings later, not to Belcross, but to the small room above the mending shop where she took her supper alone, having asked the shopkeeper's wife, with a courtesy that left the woman flustered for a week afterward, whether he might be permitted to call. He came without the plain coat this time. He came, Verity understood at once, as himself, though he gave no title at the door, and the shopkeeper's wife, not knowing him, showed him up simply as a gentleman calling. He stood in the doorway of her small warm room, hat in his hands, and did not sit until she asked him to, and when he spoke it, was without any of the careful stillness he had always worn like armour in the East Room. "My name is Gideon Aldrich," he said. "I am the Duke of Rothmere. I gave you a false name because I did not know, when I began, whether I wanted to be known to you as myself or as nothing at all, and by the time I understood which I wanted, I did not know how to unmake the lie without losing you along with it." She did not answer at once. She let him go on, because she had learned that silence, held long enough, drew the truest words out of a person faster than any question could. "I saw you the first night you read to him," he said. "I stood in the corridor because I could not make myself walk further. I have not been able to walk further in 3 years, and I watched you sit in a room nobody visits and read to a man nobody remembers as though it cost you nothing to do it, though I have since learned it cost you an evening's rest and half your candle allowance, and you never once thought that worth mentioning. I wanted to see what a person does when she believes no one of any consequence is watching. That is the only test I know that tells the truth about anybody. You passed it before you ever knew you were being examined." Her hands, folded in her lap, had not moved, though something behind her eyes had. "And Mr. Aldrich," she said. "Your father. I have not been able to sit in that room and speak to him since the quarrel," he said. "He wanted me married to a woman I had already learned to distrust, and I told him things in anger I have never forgiven myself for saying, and within the month he had the apoplexy. And I have believed since, whatever the physicians tell me, that I am the reason for it. I could pay for his comfort. I could not make myself sit where you sat. You did, without knowing him, without being asked, without wanting anything for it. I do not know how to tell you what that meant to a man who has spent 3 years unable to do the same thing himself." Verity was quiet a long moment. Outside, faintly, a bell somewhere in the town struck the hour, and neither of them moved until it had finished. "I do not want an apology dressed up as a courtship," she said finally. "If you have come here because you are grateful, say so plainly, and I will accept your gratitude, and we will go on as we were. But if you have come for something else, I will have it said honestly, or not said at all. I have had enough of names that were not names, and rooms where I did not know who was watching me through the door. I have not come for gratitude," he said. "I have come because I have thought of nothing else for 3 months but the sound of your voice reading fables to a man who could not answer you, and because I would rather have your honest no than a yes built on not knowing who asked for it. I am not asking you anything tonight. I only wanted you to know the truth of me, whole, before I asked you anything at all." She looked at him for a long time in the candlelight, this grave, careful man who had watched her from doorways and paid for her coal in secret, and could not, even now, quite make himself press her for an answer he plainly wanted very badly. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Thank you for letting me," he said, and something in the way he said it, low and unpractised, made her understand that he meant the opposite thing entirely, that he was thanking her not for permission, but for the plain fact that she had listened, without turning him out. And she found, to her own surprise, that she was smiling. the first real smile she had given him in 3 months of evenings. He did not stay long after that. He asked only whether he might come again, as himself this time, with no false name between them, and she said he might. And he went out into the cold with his hat in his hand, and did not look, for once, like a man carrying a stone in his boot. He came again 3 days later, and asked whether she would walk with him to Belcross, since his father, Mrs. Prowse had told him, had grown restless without his evening reading, and the new attendant did not know the fables he liked. "I have been to see him myself, twice now," Gideon told her as they walked, the fog thin that evening, the first clear cold night in a fortnight. "It is not easy. It may never be easy. But I go now, and I sit, and I do not leave after a quarter of an hour the way I used to. I have you to thank for that, though you did nothing to earn the thanking beyond being yourself where I could see it. I did not do it to teach you anything," she said. "I know it," he said. "That is precisely why it taught me something." They walked into the East Room together that evening, and Verity took up the old chair, and Gideon stood at his father's other side, closer than she had ever seen him stand, and she opened the brown book and began, as always, to read. Mr. Aldrich's eyes went from her face to his son's and back again, and his right hand moved on the coverlet, and this time Gideon reached down and took it in both of his own, gently the way one takes a bird that has stopped struggling, and held it through the whole of the fable, and did not let go until she had finished. Winter turned towards spring slowly that year, the way it always does, more thaw than thunder, and Gideon came to Belcross most evenings now, sometimes before Verity, and sometimes after, and the two things that had once been entirely separate in her life, the man and the room, folded quietly into one habit she no longer had to explain to anyone. Lady Cordelia did not come to the Almshouse again that season. She came once to the house on Gideon's business, uninvited, and found him in the small parlour with Verity, teaching her, of all unlikely things, to play at chess, and she made some remark, light and cutting in the old way, about laundresses who had learned to angle for a duke's attention through his invalid father. Gideon did not raise his voice. He set down the chess piece in his hand very carefully, the way a man sets down something he does not trust himself to hold if he is angry. "You will not speak to Miss Hale in that manner in my house," he said, "or in any house of mine, ever again. She sat with my father when I could not make myself do it. You arranged to have her sent away rather than be reminded of it. I have been slow to see people plainly, aunt. I do not intend to go on being slow." Lady Cordelia's face did something complicated and did not soften. She left within the week for a cousin's house in Bath, and stayed there a considerable while, and the letters she sent afterward, addressed to Gideon in her old imperious hand, went, by his own order, unopened into the fire, one by one, without comment. Verity's withdrawal, when it came again, was smaller this time, and briefer, and came not from cruelty but from her own caution. There was talk in the town, inevitably, once she was seen walking with the Duke of Rothermere more than once, and some of it was unkind, and some of it frightened her more than Lady Cordelia's bell laugh ever had, because it was the talk of ordinary people, the kind she had to live among after he had gone home to his grand house and forgotten, perhaps, how loud a small town's whispering could be. "I do not know that I can be what your world expects a duchess to be," she told him one evening plainly, because plainness was the only currency she had ever trusted. "I have no fortune, no family, no training in it. I mend linens for a living. I do not know how to be looked at the way your aunt looks at people, and I do not think I could learn it without losing something of myself I am not willing to lose. He did not argue with her. He had learned, in the months since the East Room, that arguing with Verity Hale when she had decided something was a plain fact rarely moved her, and that the only honest response to a fear stated plainly was an answer stated just as plainly. "I am not asking you to become anyone else," he said. "I fell in love with a woman who read to a stranger for no reward and told my aunt to her face that fairness and kindness are not the same thing. I did not fall in love with a duchess. If you never learn to be looked at the way my aunt looks at people, I will count that among the reasons I chose you." "I will not answer you tonight," she said. "I am not asking you to," he said. "I would rather have your no freely given than your yes because you felt you must. I will ask again in the spring, when the roads are dry and you have had the whole of the winter to be certain, and your no will be as safe with me then as your yes." She did not answer that either. But she did not step back from him again after that evening, and the town's talk, having nothing further to feed on, beyond a duke walking respectfully with a laundress and asking nothing improper of her, wore itself thin by March and was replaced, as such talk always is, by some newer scandal belonging to someone else. Mr. Aldrich died in April, quietly, in his sleep, with his son's hand in his and Verity reading, at the very end, not a fable but a psalm, because the matron had said, gently, that it might be a comfort, and it seemed from the stillness of his face afterward to have been one. He had not spoken a word in 3 years. In the last week of his life he had managed, once, with tremendous effort, to close his fingers around his son's hand when Gideon apologised, at last, for every angry word spoken before the illness. And Gideon had taken that closing of the fingers for the forgiveness it plainly was, and had wept, finally in front of Verity, without shame, for the first time she had ever seen him do it. He was not a duke when the apoplexy took him, only a gentleman of good former standing, and so there was no grand funeral, only a quiet one, which Gideon said afterward was exactly as his father would have wished it, having spent his last years asking, above everything else, not to be made a spectacle of. Gideon asked her again in May, in the garden at Rothmere, where the apple trees were in flower and the smell of them came sweet on the wind, and this time she did not ask for another day to think. "I have thought of little else since April," she told him. "I will not pretend I came to it easily. But I have decided that a man who watched me from a doorway and never once tried to buy my notice with anything but honesty is a man I would be a fool to refuse out of fear of what other people might say about my hands or my birth. I will marry you, Gideon Aldrich, on the condition that you never again give me a false name for any reason, however careful, and that whatever you feel, you say it to me plainly, the way you have said everything else since that night in my room above the shop." "Yes," he said. It was the only word he needed, and it was also, she noticed, the shortest sentence she had ever heard him speak. He drew the glove from her hand himself, finger by finger, slowly in the garden, and kissed her bare knuckles, red still from the lie, though there was no longer any need for her to do her own washing, and she did not pull away, and neither of them said anything at all for a long moment, because there was, for once, nothing that wanted saying. The wedding, when it came in June, was small, as weddings go for a duke, though a duke's small wedding is still a considerable thing to everyone but the 2 people standing at the centre of it, and Verity wore no jewels but a plain gold ring, and carried, tucked absurdly into her bouquet at Mrs. Prowse's insistence, a single sprig of rosemary for remembrance, of the man in the East Room who had not lived to see it, but whose hand, both of them agreed, had somehow brought it about. A year later, in the small parlour at Rothmere, where the fire was kept low and steady through the coldest months, Verity sat with a book open on her knee. Not fables this time, but a novel Gideon had brought her from town. And he sat across from her with his hand resting, without either of them remarking on it any more, over hers, on the arm of her chair, the brown book, its spine mended twice now by her own careful hand, sat on the table by the window, where it had sat every evening since the wedding, in every room they used, moved from parlour to bedroom to garden bench and back, as the weather and their moods required, because neither of them had ever been willing to leave it packed away. Lady Cordelia remained in Bath. She wrote once more that winter, a short cold letter of congratulation nobody quite believed, and Gideon answered it himself this time, briefly and without cruelty, and did not invite her back, and she did not ask to come. Mrs. Prowse stayed on at Rothmere as housekeeper still, drier and warmer by turns than ever, and told the story of the false name and the East Room to any new servant who asked why the Duchess kept an old, battered fable book on the good parlour table among the fine ones, until it had become, in the way such stories do in a well-run household, less a secret than a kind of family scripture. The rotted plank in the bridge over the Belcross stream was mended that same spring, at the Duchess's own quiet instruction and her own quiet payment, with no name attached to the order, because she had found in the end that she had learned that particular habit from somewhere, and saw no reason to break it now that she had the means to indulge it properly. The fire popped once, low in the grate, and Gideon's hand tightened slightly over hers, and neither of them looked up from what they were doing, because there was no longer any need to look up to know the other was there. A person's worth is never proven by what is done in the light, where every eye can weigh it, and every hand is ready to applaud. It is proven only by what is done in a room believed empty, for someone who can give nothing back, by a person who never once imagined that anybody of consequence was watching from the door.